Carrie Levine, the editor-in-chief of Votebeat. Thank you for joining us on this event on how the Trump administration could impact the 2026 midterm elections. We initially wanted to call it making a federal case of it. The Constitution gives authority over elections to the states and to Congress, but the Trump administration has moved aggressively to exercise more executive authority and oversight of American elections. Our journalists at Votebeat have been covering those efforts extensively. A year ago today, President Trump issued an executive order on elections that would have, among other things, moved to requiring documented proof of citizenship from those registering to vote. Since then, federal judges have so far blocked most key provisions from going into effect. Nonetheless, citing the order, federal agencies have taken significant steps on elections. The Justice Department, for example, has so far sued 29 states and the District of Columbia for access to unredacted voter rolls, in what the agency has said is an urgent need before the midterm elections to know that elections are secure and that non-citizens, deceased people, and voters with multiple records are not registered to vote. We've reported on the efforts to require citizenship proof from voters at the state and national levels, the Save America Act, which is pending in Congress, the effects of the president's executive order, and state legislation that reflects the president's priorities. To keep up with our reporting, please subscribe to our newsletters at votebeat.org/newsletters. Also, we're a nonprofit newsroom, and our journalism relies on support from our readers. Please support our work and events like this one as you're able by giving any amount at votebeat.org/donate. I'll be joined today by Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon, a Democrat, and former Alabama Secretary of State John Merrill, a Republican, to discuss the many implications of the Trump administration's push for increased federal oversight of elections, including how this affects the 2026 midterm elections. Steve Simon is Minnesota's 22nd Secretary of State. He partners with township, city, and county officials to organize elections on behalf of Minnesota's nearly 4 million eligible voters, and to ensure that the election system is fair. Before being elected Minnesota's Secretary of State, Secretary Simon served in the Minnesota House of Representatives for 10 years, representing St. Louis Park and Hopkins, Minnesota. He also served as an Assistant Attorney General of Minnesota and was a lawyer in private practice. John Merrill was Alabama's Secretary of State for 8 years. He was first elected in 2014. During his time in office, the office set new records in the state's history for voter registration and participation. And I know Secretary Merrill still knows these numbers by heart, registering a total of 2,215,229 new voters and removing more than 1.3 million names from the voter list. Did I get that right, Secretary Merrill? He was first elected to public office as a representative of Alabama House District 62 in 2010. After leaving office, Merrill worked for Wagoner Engineering and established Morning in Alabama Consulting LLC, which provides election security consulting and other services. Thank you both very much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. We have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to dive in. And if you're listening and you want to submit questions during the event, please do so by using the Q&A button. Okay, to start it off, a question for both of you, starting with Secretary Merrill. But what's different about how the Trump administration is approaching elections as the midterm elections near? And what do you think is the appropriate role for the executive branch here? Where's the line between appropriate federal oversight and exceeding federal authority?
Those are great questions, Carrie, and thank you so much for having Secretary Simon and me as your guest today. We're excited to be with you. We always enjoy working together. I think that this is a topic that's on the front of many people's minds for a lot of different reasons, but I think it should also be noted that the president is obviously expressing some real interest and concern about elections and election administration, because the likelihood of him ever appearing on a ballot again is almost non-existent. We know that he cannot, by the Constitution, seek another term as our president. So the fact that he continues to want to make sure that elections in all 8,000 jurisdictions across our nation are safe, secure, transparent, and accountable, I think should be applauded. Now, whether or not people agree with the path that he's taken is another option up for debate. I do think it's important to note that the midterms are very important, and especially at this time, because with a margin of only one individual member between the Democrats being in control of the United States Congress and Republicans retaining control of the United States Congress is obviously something that people are very, very interested in. Margins are a little greater there in the Senate, but not in the House. But I think that it's important to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that our founding fathers delegated the authority for elections at the state level to our individual member states. And that's where it should remain. Now, as far as federal intervention is involved, the federal government, the federal courts have never been hesitant about letting it be known what their take is on certain issues, what their desire is to see changes occur in certain topic areas. But I do think it's important to remember that the elections are best left up to the people who administer those, and those are the people in the 8,000 jurisdictions across the 50 states in the United States of America.
Thank you, Secretary Merrill. Secretary Simon?
Well, first, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I always love doing anything with my former colleague, Secretary Merrill, who was just a great, active, effective, good faith partner when we served together. So how is the Trump administration different? I think, as Secretary Merrill says, there's no question that this president has shown a greater interest, a very intense interest in these issues, more so than I've seen from any prior president of either party. He cares about them deeply, obviously, intensely, has strong points of view. And also my sense is that the Trump administration in this area is trying to push boundaries, is trying to see where they might, where litigation might lead, and is sort of testing the limits. I mean, you mentioned the executive order a year ago today. You're right that the courts did push back and invalidate large sections of that, but not all of it. The section that in Minnesota we were the most concerned with had to do with the documentary proof of citizenship requirement. And our point, we joined a number of states in pushing back against that, was to just put the merits on the shelf for a minute. You know, reasonable people on this call and in our country can disagree on the policy. Is that good or is that bad? But our point was that Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution just doesn't give any president, this or any other one, the ability to do this thing by executive order. That the proper way to do it is the way it's being attempted to be done right now, which is an act of Congress. And that's totally appropriate procedurally. Our point was that that's the way to do it, not by executive order. As to that particular part, the courts have agreed, but that is different. I mean, I think the president is attempting to tee up by executive order certain debates about the limits of the law. My guess, and I'm only speculating here, is that folks advising him in the White House probably thought, all right, we'll put this executive order out. Probably not all of it's going to survive. Maybe most of it won't survive. But let's at least put down a marker, again, I'm speculating, and test the limits of the language in the Constitution and elsewhere and see where it takes us, see how much, how much it can stretch. That's my sense, only my sense.
Thank you both. So, I mean, then that leads me to the next question, which is to set the table here. There's just a lot of concern among experts and many members of the public about the potential for the federal government to directly intervene in elections. Trump himself called to take over the voting, to nationalize the voting. I've talked to a lot of election officials who have said that's prompted them to consider a lot of scenarios, including the prospect of armed federal agents or ICE at the polls, at polling places. Administration officials have said there's no plans for that. But Secretary Simon, your state, Minnesota, has really been in the national spotlight dealing with ICE in recent months, and that's been an issue there. How are you preparing for the possibility of federal intervention in the midterm elections? How are you thinking about it and working with local officials to prepare for that?
Right. Well, I will just say to zoom out a little bit, our state, and I gather every state, I'm sure Secretary Merrill, when he was in charge in Alabama, we have sort of an all hazards approach, meaning we have to plan for all sorts of things that may or may not materialize. There may be a very small chance that these things happen. We have to plan with our partners, of course, at the local level for things like bomb threats or a weather event or a power outage. You have to have a plan for that, even though there is less than a 1% chance that those things are going to happen. I would add this year a new a feature or a new addition to that category, which is the possibility of some sort of federal interference directly or indirectly. It's not a prediction, just as we don't predict that there's going to be a bomb threat, but it is a precaution. And so we're gaming out in our heads, what could that look like? Now, you mentioned one in particular, which is what if there are federal law enforcement personnel in and around certain polling places? Again, not a prediction, but we do have to sort of think about that. There's a non-zero chance of that sort of thing happening. And on that one micro issue, we're getting a lot of advice about Minnesota law and its application to federal agents. We do in Minnesota have really clear laws on the books about law enforcement roles. They've been on there for many decades. This isn't something that's recent. I guess the legal question will be, do those laws apply to federal agents? We know they apply to state and local. Do they apply to federal agents? We believe the answer is yes. And so we're prepared with our partners to enforce that. So it applies to everyone equally, federal, state, a sheriff's deputy, just as much as it would someone from ICE or Border Patrol. And Minnesota law has drawn some lines around polling places, and not only in terms of the distances, but in terms of what specific conduct in and around polling places, with all the common sense exceptions you would imagine, right? So we're thinking a lot about that in particular, but more broadly about sort of gaming out with partners. What are some of the things we might see? Again, might never happen, might never materialize, just like the tornado might never materialize, but this is in that bucket now of things that we have to be thinking about.
Secretary Merrill, I know you still work with a lot of election officials. I'd love to know what you're hearing out there on this. And, also, I'd love to know from you, as someone who has done this job, how can election officials, in thinking about this, respond to voters' concerns that voting won't be safe and secure without appearing Pollyannish or dismissive about the risks? And how can they convince voters in this environment that their vote will be counted and will matter?
Harry, it's important to remember, especially when it comes to observation or participation in the elections process, like you just mentioned with law enforcement, and Secretary Simon mentioned that, is that the most important thing that we are supposed to do is to follow the established state and federal laws that are already on the books. And when we do that, you'll never go wrong. If you get outside of those boundaries and start to do something because you think it's a good idea or believe that it will be helpful, that's a problem. No matter how good an idea it is, and no matter how much help you think it can provide, it's not ever a good idea to go outside the scope and boundaries of the established laws at the state or federal level. I think one of the things that a number of people in our state would be concerned about, not necessarily one political party or one race, but our state has a history of not necessarily being very accommodating or friendly to certain parties that may be interested in voting. And that should be noted. And whenever you have individuals or groups that may be present in a particular environment that could cause some level of consternation for certain voters, it may be viewed as intimidation. It may be viewed as not a spirit of cooperation. And so you have to make sure that if you want to have that assistance, or if that assistance is offered, or if that assistance is provided and directed by a higher authority, that the explanation and the education of why those individuals are there is something that needs to be presented, and it needs to be understood by the average voter. So that way people will not come to their individual polling site, any one of the 1,980 sites in our state, in our 67 counties, and feel as though they are being threatened instead of being assisted.
So, how would you advise election officials to think about that, to think about communicating with voters effectively about these possibilities, both of you?
Yes, one of the things that often happens when we have a situation like the one that's been described here is that people let their individual emotions or their moods or their philosophies about that assistance become the point of conversation, as opposed to understanding why it may be offered and it may be being done and why it should be accepted for what it is. That's why I said you must follow established state and federal laws. I know one of the things that I had the privilege to do when I was the secretary was to be an international election observer. I actually did that in Russia in September of 2016, back in the period of time right before our presidential election. And there were people that were on the trip that said, how would this go over in Alabama? And I said, well, our laws do not allow for election observers. Only people that are from Alabama, that live in Alabama, can come and participate in that process. And Steve mentioned earlier about how their laws specifically outline the duties and responsibilities of law enforcement agents that may be in a polling site. And so, again, the most important thing is making sure that people understand. And Carrie, if that requires having a written page that's available to be distributed or just posted at the polling site so people will understand and there's no question about why they're there, then I think that may be necessary. But what we have to do is to remember to err on the side of providing aid and comfort to the voter within the scope and boundary of the law.
Secretary Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I want to pick up on a couple useful threads that John just talked about. I think that's right. We have to talk about what the laws are, which I think will soothe and comfort a lot of people who are maybe worried or concerned about that. I think the balance we're always facing, whether it's on cybersecurity or what we're talking about today, is how to talk about what the potential problem is or threat or challenge without being alarmist, without being so alarmist that we are inadvertently scaring people away from voting because they've heard all this talk about what the potential threats and hassles will be. So we're trying to balance that. We want to call it out and name it and not avoid it, but in the same breath, tell people what the workarounds are. For example, if someone in Minnesota or in any state, most states, I should say, is concerned about the polling place on election day for whatever reason, whether their concern is reasonable, unreasonable, or anything else. What we say, and what many states are able to say, is, look, if you're concerned about a polling place, remember the law. You can vote from home. So if you don't want to go to a polling place, you're afraid you'll have to run the gauntlet of something or someone, at least in Minnesota and many states, but not all, you can vote from home. Just remember that. So reminding people what the rules are can have a way of soothing people who have concerns. So it's always, to my way of thinking, no matter what the challenge is, naming it, but talking about what the workarounds or the ways to mitigate those are. And I think that's the challenge we have. We don't want to talk so much so often about the threats that we dissuade people from voting, but yet we need to name them and be honest about what they are or could be.
So going back to the president's executive order, and I think this time we'll start with Secretary Merrill. It was issued a year ago. It was a sweeping executive order that would have overhauled many things about elections. As you pointed out, courts have blocked many provisions, but not all. I'd love you each to talk about what has changed and what has not changed because of that executive order.
Well, obviously, a number of things would love to be embraced by certain groups. Another set of things would be discarded by other individuals that are in administrative positions as far as elections are concerned. I think the most important thing that has happened, Carrie, is a national dialogue about elections that has kind of changed the tenor of where we're going, that was brought into light because of the executive order that was issued. And that's one of the reasons why, not whether it's good or bad, but the discussion about the SAVE Act is in the news almost every day because people are talking about administrative changes that could take place in the elections process. They want to make sure that people are well represented. They want to make sure that people have their voice heard and that when the time comes that their vote will be counted. And I believe that that's the most important thing that has happened is that the president has brought what many had considered a mundane, almost perfunctory task into light, where you are making sure that you understand why things are occurring the way that they are. And before I give my platform back to you on this particular question, I think it's important to remember the following. We have to make sure that people know that as long as we follow established state and federal laws, we're doing everything that we're supposed to do the way that we're supposed to do it, then we are doing the things that we're required to do. But the other thing is, it's been my personal experience and observation. I don't know about Secretary Simon. I'd love for him to speak to this. But most of the people who are concerned about accountability, transparency, and whether or not votes are being counted or whether or not procedures are being followed accurately, most of the people who do the talking about this, whether they be people with a liberal perspective or a very conservative perspective, it's been my experience and observation that most of these people have never been to the polling place except to vote. They've never worked in the polls. They've never been a part of the process and understanding how it's set up, how it's broken down, what the individual procedures are. And I encouraged all of those individuals to contact their local judge of probate court in our state, who is the local election official who's responsible for administering the elections, so they could see the process and understand how safe and secure that it was, and how open and transparent and accountable that the entire system is and has been.
And just to follow up on that before we go to Secretary Simon, do you think the fact that this debate is happening, that people are now paying attention to these facts of election administration in a way that they weren't previously, has that been for the good? Has that been for the better? Are people getting a better understanding from it? Are they more confused? What are you noticing as the effect of that?
I really think that it's better, because I think the more that you talk about a topic and the more that you learn about a topic, the more educated you can become about that topic. But I also think that it has led to a number of arguments. It's led to a number of political disagreements that have occurred from elected officials, as well as just friends that you would see at Walmart or at church or at the PTA meeting. But it's often because the things that Steve and I were talking about earlier, in that people are not really willing to or interested in listening to others. They're more interested in making sure that their opinion is heard about that particular topic. And whenever that happens, I had a teacher one time, Carrie, she told us this: you never learned anything when you were talking.
Well, that's true. That's why I'm listening to you both. Secretary Simon.
Yes, I agree with a lot of what John just said. I would only add that what I think has changed is there's no question that a couple issues in particular have now gained a lot more prominence because of that executive order. One is the SAVE Act, or Save America Act, which we're debating now in Congress, in part because that portion of the executive order was struck down. The judges have said sensibly, and Minnesota was a party to that, that the president can't just do that by executive order. You got to go through an act of Congress. So that's one. The other one, though, is, remember, just this week, the Supreme Court heard oral argument on the Watson case, named for our colleague, Mississippi Secretary of State Michael Watson. And that is a case that emanated from the executive order as well, having to do with whether ballots should be counted if received in the mail after Election Day. So the Supreme Court's going to decide that issue, and that gained increasing prominence because of that executive order. That sort of got the ball rolling. So there's no question that elections issues are arguably more front and center now than they would have been without that executive order. But I think it's not just the executive order. I mean, it's important to discuss it. I think overall, the last several years, elections issues have taken on a prominence that they haven't in a long time. And the way I put it in Minnesota to folks is, look, when I first ran for this office, and Secretary Merrill and I ran the same year in our respective states, let's just put it this way. I used to have to do a lot more explaining about what this office and this post was. Now, a few years down the road, I have to do a lot less explaining. I think the public has come to understand and appreciate this post. I don't mean me as an individual. I mean the post, the job, the office of Secretary of State. It's more in the news. It's gotten a lot more attention and interest and scrutiny. And that's as a result of a lot of things, not just the executive order over the last decade or so.
And so following up on that, you're right. It's been several years of debate over election administration procedures at a very high level, at a very high volume. Um, why? Why now? Why this? Obviously, as you have both pointed out, the president's really interested in elections and how they're run, has had a lot to say about it.
But Carrie, and I don't want you to lose your train of thought, but I think it's important to interject this here. One of the things that has been said, and the president has been noted for taking this to a different level, when he says mail-in voting is bad, it's something that should be discontinued, it's something that we don't need because it can lead to cheating, it can lead to fraud, etc. And yet we know that the president believes in and practices mail-in voting through the absentee process because he just participated in a local election in Florida last week through the absentee. Right. So why not introduce that? Because it's clear that the president has some concerns about certain types of election administration, but he does not always make it exactly clear as to what his major concerns are about those issues. And this is one of those situations that I mean, he believes enough in the process that he participated in the process, but he also has major concerns about the way that some ballots are handled in states that may have universal vote by mail as opposed to the absentee by mail process and things of that nature. So I think that should be noted.
That's a good point, and I'm glad that you brought it up. Let's talk about the Department of Justice's requests and lawsuits for access to unredacted state voter rolls. And by that, I mean versions of the voter rolls that are not typically made public, that include some of voters' personal information, so partial social security numbers, driver's license numbers, parts that are not full birth dates, parts that are not ordinarily made public. The Justice Department has said that they need this to make sure that states are maintaining their voter rolls in accordance with federal law and to look for dead voters, non-citizens, others who may be ineligible. They're questioning how, they're questioning how states are maintaining their voter rolls. And there also is reportedly something of an effort to build a nationwide voter roll that would be a resource for the federal government. So Secretary Simon, I know I'm asking you about something that you're in active litigation about.
Right.
And so I'm sure that there's some limits to what you can say, but I would really appreciate it if you could address why you didn't turn over the voter roll and what the issues are at play here. What's appropriate about this,
Sure.
From your point of view or not?
Yeah, I can talk in very broad brushstrokes, given that we're in litigation. As you said, we're one of the 29 states being sued, but I don't mind talking in very broad brushstrokes. So starting last June, as you said, the federal government reached out to what would eventually become 49 states and asked for exactly this information. And as you sort of teased out in your question, we sell for $46 what we call the voter file to candidates and campaigns and political parties all the time. It's $46. It's name, address, year of birth, voter history, meaning what elections you voted in, obviously not who you voted for, that we do. But we got this request. And remember, this is a real mainstream position. 32 states by my last count out of the 49 are taking the same legal position as us, which, speaking for Minnesota, starts and ends with the law, not who we like or dislike or policy preferences, but the law. And the law, as we read it, both state and federal, is that the Department of Justice isn't entitled to the sensitive personal data like partial social security or birth dates. And we'll see, right? That's being litigated right now in court. And let me just say as an aside, and maybe I don't have to for an audience like this, but sometimes in popular culture or everyday life, there's this stigma about litigation that if you've been sued, that's some bad or shameful thing. But look, this is exactly where this dispute belongs. We have a view on what the law says. The federal government has a very different view on what the law says. And instead of shooting it out in the streets, we go to a court of law. That's what you do in a civilized country. So this is the very reason we have courts, right? Who's right on the view of the law? And of course, we'll abide by whatever the court system says. But That's what's being teed up in Minnesota and other states, our view of the law, first, second, and third, which is what does the law say about what they're entitled to get? We have one view, they have another. We'll see what happens in the courts.
And I'm hearing you really echo what Secretary Merrill said earlier about being guided by what's in state and federal law. And Secretary Merrill, I know that you are not, currently in office. You don't have to decide if what the law tells you about turning over this version of the voter roll or not. But I will say to you, what are some things that someone could do with this version of the voter roll? How could the administration, if it obtains it, use it? Why are people concerned about this?
Carrie, let's think back past where we are here with the request from the Justice Department to February, March of 2017. After President Trump was elected, he was sworn in January 20th. He's in his first term. There was a Presidential Commission on Election Integrity that was established. And in that Presidential Commission on Election Integrity, Chris Kobach, who was the Secretary of State in Kansas, who now serves as their Attorney General, headed up this team of individuals that were asked to collect data. Part of the data was voter rolls from each one of the states in order to process this and to evaluate and assess what the data revealed and whether or not there needed to be certain steps taken to preserve the voter rolls. And I know you remember all of this, and I know that Secretary Simon remembers all of this. And the thing that was so disappointing to me, and I was in my first term as secretary. Secretary Simon was in his first term. But one of the things that did not take place was that Chris and his team did not have a White House intern or someone else that they had some level of confidence in that could have just been a student at any institution of higher learning in our nation, make a call or collect records from all 50 states to determine who was going to be able to provide the information that they wanted without having a codification change or without having additional discussions with other groups about who could receive this based on what their existing federal and state laws were related to this topic. And I told Chris when he called me, I said, brother, you can't have it from Alabama because we are not allowed to give it to you. You are not included in the law that would show you that you can actually have access to this information. What ended up happening, and Steve can speak to this as well as I, but we had some colleagues that they decided they were going to use this as a way to bust the president in the head and to stick Chris with a poke a bear method. And in doing that, it ended up being a political discussion instead of just being a conversation about what's allowable by law. What are you trying to do with this? That's all part of that education process that we're talking about. And Steve mentioned about being sued, and he's been sued a lot of times. He's had a lot of success. I was sued 28 times as secretary. We were 28-0. Roll Tide.
I love it.
So following up on that, Secretary Merrill, as you point out, time is a flat circle, right? A version of this happened before. So did we learn anything from that? I mean, here we are.
We learned that people don't pay attention. And as has been said many times before, and it's been attributed to many people in our history, that as you look at history, if you don't give attention to things that have occurred before, they're likely to occur again. And that's very disappointing that that's exactly where we are here, is that those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
But it's such recent past.
I know, 10 years. It's sad. It's where we are. But what we need to understand is if there's only one way to accomplish the goal, whatever the goal is, you need to explain this is the reason why we're doing this. This is the method that we're choosing to take in order to accomplish this goal. If there are other ways to do it, as there were with Chris and M's effort, which failed miserably, then at that point, you need to make sure that you are explaining to people the reason for this to happen as opposed to going the way that it is now. As a matter of fact, one of our colleagues who at the time, he was elected in the same cycle that we were, Alex Padilla. He was the secretary in California. Alex is now sitting United States Senator. And in that particular role, Senator Husted, John Husted, who took Vice President Vance's seat in Washington, was a member of our body when all of this was taking place. So not only do they remember it, they were a part of that and a part of the discussion. And that's unfortunate that the people in justice that wanted to secure this information didn't go to those two guys that are sitting right there in the Senate office buildings and say, gentlemen, we know y'all had some experience in this area. Why don't you share with us what your position is and why you are where you are? Those things to me could be so helpful if we just took time to ask a question of someone that, and not believing that they've got nefarious intent in their response, but that they want to be helpful in their response to you. And when we don't do that, Carrie, we end up having what could be a major problem because people think, well, you're trying to hide something, or you're not being forthcoming, or you're not trying to be cooperative because you don't agree with me and you don't agree with my president, or you don't agree with my philosophy, which differs from the president.
Secretary Simon, thoughts on that?
Well, could you repeat the question again?
Yeah. I think we definitely covered a lot of ground there. I think what I'm trying to get at is, the fact is, as Secretary Merrill points out, we've been here before. We've had this fight
Yes. Oh, yes, right.
and people are reading a lot of intent into this. Why haven't we learned from how this has played out last time? Why are we here again? Why is the second Trump administration making this effort in this way when it played out the way it did during the first Trump administration?
Well, I will say that in the first Trump administration, as Secretary Merrill said, this was a commission. It didn't have subpoena power. It was just sort of a voluntary request. This is different now, right? So it's different in that sense. It's now the Department of Justice. It's the big leagues, and they're asking us, they're sort of compelling us to produce these documents. That's different than what happened before. So now you get into the litigation and the legal process. But I think the common thread through all of this is a couple things. First, an ongoing elevation of elections issues for sure over the last decade. And the other is, which is the theme of this event today, is sort of a more aggressive federal approach to election oversight, if not more than oversight, right? So what they're saying is, and I'm getting a little bit into the litigation, but again, broad brushstrokes, what they seem to be saying is that the Help America Vote Act, for example, confers upon the federal government or the Justice Department the ability to enforce certain things against the states when it comes to things like list maintenance and the like. Our legal position is no, it doesn't. The Help America Vote Act requires that states have these systems in place, but it doesn't confer upon the federal government or the Justice Department the ability to look over the shoulder and be sort of next level secretaries of state. That's our legal position. We'll see what the courts say. But that is different, I think, this time. It's more formalized. It's not just an informal blue ribbon commission. And it's an attempt to, they would say, perform oversight to make sure we're complying with HAVA. But our point is complying with HAVA. We're complying with HAVA. All the states, all the 29 states are complying with HAVA, and that neither HAVA nor any law gives them the right to sort of second guess the way that we're complying. That's it in a nutshell. It's deeper than that and more in the weeds than that, but that is the sort of big picture of what we're arguing about. Yeah.
So obviously every study has found that voter fraud in the United States is rare, does not determine election outcomes except in very, very rare instances in our history. This is not something that is a pervasive problem, no matter how we look for it or how experts have studied for it. But the Justice Department has asserted that they're finding on the states that have turned over their voter rolls thousands and thousands of voters who are in some way ineligible.
But Carrie, that's because the people who control the database, the voter rolls at that level in the state, the local jurisdiction, are not doing their job as prescribed by the law and reviewing the files the way they're supposed to and using those different opportunities that exist by law, federal and state, to make sure that people are removed from the rolls as they're supposed to be removed. I don't because of nefarious intent. It's because people are not following their established procedures. And when you get lazy or sloppy or you're just negligent in your job, those things happen that way.
But even in those states, there's no sign that large numbers of ineligible voters are casting ballots in elections.
No,
Correct?
not that I'm aware of, but I think it should also be noted that anytime you have any level of voter fraud, it is a problem and it can result in a problem. Now, I don't know what Secretary Simon's experience has been with this personally. You know, we actually executed 48 elections while I was the secretary in Alabama. And I can tell you that we had 5 instances that I can recall where we had votes that resulted in a tie or resulted in a margin of 1 vote that separated the winner from the one that was unsuccessful in his or her bid. Why not mention that? Because if you have an ineligible individual participate in the process and they cast their ballot, that individual actually could have and may have decided what actually occurred in the final result of that election. So, yes, every vote counts, and sometimes more than others.
What I would say to that is, and that's true, I think the goal among secretaries of state and all election administrators should be perfection. That's the goal. We want 0 errors. As you point out, though we have not achieved 0 errors, we overall as a system have achieved what I would call a microscopic level of true fraud. And I think that's through the diligent efforts of a lot of people. I think Secretary Merrill and you are right to point out the distinction between those who are not on the voting rolls, who are on the voting rolls and shouldn't be, and the next step, which is anyone actually cast a ballot. That doesn't make it excusable, as Secretary Merrill implies. You still got to be diligent about that. I guess where I come in all of this is we have to have a healthy balance, right, between access and security. I think every election system strives to find that perfect balance, if there is such a thing. We're chasing after that perfect blend of access and security. You want both. You need both. And I think what some of the current debates come down to is really that, whether it's the SAVE Act or anything else, given what at least I would say is the microscopic level of misconduct, what security measures are reasonable and not reasonable? Because what I don't think anyone wants is a situation where in the name of in that chase for perfection, we do something even inadvertently that will disenfranchise folks, right? So it's always in any subject matter, right? I sometimes use this analogy, excuse the detour, but
Sure.
Could we get to 0 traffic deaths in America? Yes, if the speed limit were 10 miles an hour and we were all we all had to wear mandatory, suits of armor or, styrofoam outfits or whatever it is, and we could travel no more than 10 miles an hour. But we'd all say that's silly. That's ridiculous. We're chasing perfection. We want there to be 0 deaths, but not at any cost, right? Same here. We know the problem is microscopic. What lengths will we go to? And what are the consequences of that? And different people, reasonable people, are going to come out differently, right? But I think that's always the debate. What is that perfect blend of access and security? No 2 people are going to see it exactly the same.
And that's so true, Steve. And I'll say this because I know you agree with me on this, but we can never sacrifice ability for security in the elections process. And if we start to do that, then the result will be the ability to manipulate or to expose irregularities or inconsistencies that did not exist before. So you have to be careful about what you're doing, just like you described. You have to make sure that you're taking the appropriate steps and you're doing the things that are necessary in order to be successful. But you have to be effective in the administration of the elections process as well. But you cannot sacrifice the accessibility for security. And the last thing that I'll say on this too, Carrie, I think this is very important to remember, is that if we were having a conversation and we said, in Alabama, for example, where we had 8 convictions on voter fraud while I was the secretary, which led the nation in that particular category. I think if I had had a certain, because a lot of times people will come back and say, well, you only had 8. And I was like, yes, we had 8. And I say to them, what if I told you we only had 8 people in the state that wanted to register to vote, but were not able to register? Would you think that would be too many? And every time the response is, oh, yes, 1 is too many. And that's why I say, just like Steve, 1 case of voter fraud is too many. So we have to understand that both of those things are important and both of them have to be dealt with. But you can't allow the conversation to just become about the merits of that. It has to be about how it fits in the overall picture.
I think that's a really important point. I am enjoying this discussion very much, and I'm realizing we're getting tight on time. So I'm going to turn to something that is on everyone's mind, which is the 2020 election and the new efforts to investigate the 2020 election. As everyone knows, after the 2020 election, there were many baseless assertions of fraud that didn't check out, many court cases, many reviews, many audits, many recounts of the 2020 election. No evidence has emerged that has suggested the outcome was wrong. Nonetheless, the president has said the 2020 election was in some way rigged against him. And he has continued to call for investigations of it. The Justice Department, the FBI, appear to be investigating Fulton County, Georgia. There was a search of the Fulton County, Georgia elections office in which they had a search warrant to take custody of 2020 ballots and other materials. There was recently a subpoena in Maricopa County in connection with the 2020 election to the Maricopa Senate. What does the continued allegations around the 2020 election mean? What's the effect of that? You both, in your respective states, defended your state's election in 2020 and the integrity of your state's election in 2020.
And
can you talk a little bit about this?
Probably so, Carrie, because the question that was asked to me ad nauseum was, do you think that the election was stolen in 2020? And my response every time to that questioner was the same: not in Alabama. And the thing that people have to understand is I'm only responsible for the elections in Alabama. That's it. I was not responsible for the elections in Georgia or Mississippi or Florida or Tennessee, those states around us. Steve is responsible in Minnesota. He's not responsible in Michigan. He's not responsible in Ohio or North Dakota, South Dakota, all these states that are up there. He's responsible for his state. I'm responsible for my state. Now, what I shared with those same people is that if you don't feel that things went the way they were supposed to go, that people did not follow the law, people did not adhere to the spirit of the law, whatever the concern was, you have to address that in the legislative body that governs the elections process. That's the way to address it. You're not going to address it by talking about how all of these errors occurred or how these things happen. And, you know, one of Steve's constituents, Mike Lindell, went all around the nation talking about how the elections were rigged and how all these things happened. Look, I had Mike,
including Alabama, I think, right?
Look, I had him come 3 times and talk to him, and he met with my team, and we told him how things had happened. But the problem was he was not willing to listen. And I won't touch much more on this, but I do think it's important to note. One of the key things that happened was that we were in a conference room, and he and this Dr. Frank that was with him started talking about these different addresses and how, well, there's X number of people that live at this particular address, and because of their names, they can't all be related to each other. Or these particular people are all registered at this site, and they're all a certain age. And so, this is a problem. And so he continued to do that. Well, about the third time he did it, he started talking about a home, and it was the Big Oak Ranch. And he said, this is a boys' ranch. So obviously no women can be registered to vote here, and yet they are. And that's why I stopped him. I said, Mike, look, you have to understand this. This is the Big Oak Ranch. It was founded as a Big Oak Ranch in 1974 by a former All-American football player at the University of Alabama. Coach Bryant gave the money to start that home. But there are moms and dads that live in each one of these homes now that take care of these boys, just like they do at the girls' ranch. And I said, the reason that those people are registered to vote there is because that's where they live. But what I also shared about those other locations that he mentioned, one of them was a trailer park. One of them was an assisted living facility. One of them was a nursing home. One of them was an apartment complex. There were reasons for all of those things. They did not do their homework, and then they got mad at us because we didn't even have any research time. We just listened to what they were doing and looked it up in a Google search to find out where they were talking about. Look, if you've got a concern or an issue, you need to have it addressed, but you need to be diligent about how you're approaching it, and you need to be in a way to plan and execute what you're trying to share with other people if you want to be effective in that communication. And they were not. And we know the result of that, and it was not in Mike Lindell's favor.
Well, can I just say, as a Minnesotan, I am proud of all of our exports except Mike Lindell. I would say this, why 2020? Look, that was 3 elections ago now. It's time for all of us to sort of move on from that. I agree with you. And picking up on a thread of what Secretary Merrill said, the courthouse door is always open. That's the beauty of an independent judiciary, right? If you got the facts, if you got the evidence, the courthouse door, state and federal, is always open to you. And if someone believes that something didn't go as it was supposed to, or that someone committed fraud, that's the place to marshal your evidence and bring your facts. And that happened in 2020, and nearly unanimously, the courts found, as you said, that there was no, actionable fraud or wrongdoing. And so why now? I can only guess. Political reasons that President Trump himself, feels aggrieved by that particular election. Look, he won 2 presidential elections. He lost one. That's a pretty good record. And I just think that, my understanding is that the FBI in the Fulton County raid, they made off with like 700 some boxes of materials from the 2020 election. That's the other thing I tell people is, hey, look, under the category of glass half full, I suppose, the raid on Fulton County, to my knowledge, had nothing to do with the present election, with 2026. It was all rear view mirror stuff having to do with 2020. So it's not in the category of a federal raid that somehow pertain to, materials, equipment, anything else having to do with this year. So I don't know whether we're going to continue to see that, or we're going to see an FBI raid in, Philadelphia or Detroit or somewhere else where the president has alleged wrongdoing with the 2020 election. I don't know. And maybe this was just a warning shot of some kind. I don't think we'll ever know. But, I think all of us are really focused on the election in front of us right now, which by my countdown clock is 223 days away.
So to follow up on that, Secretary Simon, how do you prepare? The president has said he regrets not seizing voting machines, using the National Guard to seize voting machines and voting materials after the 2020 election. Do you think he has the power to do that? And how do you prepare for that in this election?
No, we don't think he has the power to do that. And that's one of the scenarios and situations that we, and I gather many others around the country, are gaming out. We're shadow boxing in a way. because we don't really know what's before us or what might come. And again, like the power outage, like the bomb threat, like the tornado, it may be that we prepare for something that never comes. And I hope that's the case. And it's not on my part even a prediction. Like I said, it's a precaution and one that I think people in my position should take, which is to game out and think about these scenarios in terms of seizure of equipment. Without revealing too much, the advice that we have received and what I've observed is that would be very difficult, though not impossible to pull off. It depends on the jurisdiction. We think the law is on our side, that absent demonstrated danger or fraud, that certainly preemptively, and even after an election, there are a lot of hoops and hurdles to that kind of seizure. So I won't say more about that, except that I think the law is on the side of those who would push back against any attempted federal seizure of elections. It's fact dependent, of course, but generally speaking, I think that we have the tools in the toolbox to push back against any effort to do that.
Secretary Merrill, do you agree with that perspective from an Alabama law perspective?
That I agree with. I think it's very important to be prepared, but you also have got to make sure that you are doing what you're supposed to do based on what all state and federal laws say about the election effort in your state.
And so we're running out of time. People have put questions in the chat, and I've tried to touch on some of the topics that they're raising. And I wish I had 2 more hours with you, gentlemen. You've been great. I kind of want to wrap up on a thought that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, which is there's obviously a lot of disagreements right now about how elections should work. There's policy disagreements. There's also a lot of allegations about voter fraud and voter suppression. And we're hearing about those, all of us, every day. And so I want to ask you both, starting with Secretary Merrill, going to Secretary Simon, how will people know this year with the midterms whether they're having a free and fair election? With all this discussion raging around with them, with all the allegations, with all of the political rhetoric and online misinformation, and in some cases conspiracy theories, how will people know how to gauge whether we're having a free and fair election here?
Look, about 20 minutes ago, I said that one of the things I always encourage people to do that had questions about the safety, security, transparency, and accountability of the elections process was to contact their local probate judge, sign up to be a poll worker, sign up to be a poll watcher, make sure they participated in the process at one of the 1,980 polling sites in our state, because that will allow them to see just how effectively we administer the elections in our state. If they really care, then that's what they'll do. But what they really want to do is just talk about why everything is as bad as it is and how people are cheating and how sorry folks are. And those are things that are so disappointing. But look, it's not going to stop them from doing it, because people can share their opinions, even though they're misinformed or ill-informed, and they can talk about how people are taking advantage of them and not supporting the president and just taking people's rights away from them. But that's not the case in most instances. When it is the case, those instances are usually exposed. They're usually identified. They're investigated. If it's warranted, those individuals are indicted. Then they're prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And that's the way it's supposed to be.
Secretary Simon?
I sort of go back to the courts. I mean, I well understand that there's some people who might not take my word for it, or any Secretary of State's word for it, or even law enforcement's word for it, or political parties or candidates' word for it. But in the end, we have an independent judiciary, and the courthouse door is really wide open at the state and federal level. And that's the place to marshal your evidence and your facts. But you do have to have evidence and facts. Vibes aren't enough. Bad feelings aren't enough. A sense or an intuition isn't enough. But if you have facts, if you have someone who will testify that they saw something, or you want to have access to certain parts of the election system, the courts enable everyday citizens and organizations to do that. And if at the end of the day, through an exhaustive process and the laying out of evidence, courts find that something was amiss, they will provide the remedy for that. We saw that in 2020, 2022, 2024, and again. So how will states know? I'd say at the end of the legal process post-election, where any citizen withstanding any organization can bring their facts, evidence, and testimony. If at the end of that process, the system gets a thumbs up, then people can know finally and for sure that the elections were fair, accurate, honest, and secure.
Gentlemen, I just want to thank you both so much for coming, for taking the time to be here today and talk to people. I've really enjoyed our discussion, and I really appreciate you both doing it, and appreciate your responsiveness when our journalists call you. So I really thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all of our participants in the audience for being here. Please continue to follow our coverage at votebeat.org. And I just want to thank everyone.